In 230 BC, a kingdom fell with barely a tremor across the plains of northern China. There was no legendary last stand etched into epic poetry, no dramatic duel between rival kings, no single battlefield moment that historians would later paint in heroic color. Instead, the state of Han collapsed with a quiet finality, absorbed by its western neighbor, Qin, in a campaign as calculated as it was swift. At the time, it may have seemed like just another shift in the long and brutal chess match known as the Warring States period. But history has a way of hiding its turning points in moments that appear almost ordinary. For those who study power, whether in geopolitics or business, the fall of Han offers a familiar lesson. Empires do not begin with spectacle. They begin with strategy. They begin when a leader chooses the right first target, aligns resources with long-term vision, and moves with deliberate intent. In 230 BC, Qin was not simply expanding its borders. It was sending a signal. Competition was no longer enough. Domination was the objective. At the center of this decision stood a young ruler, Zheng, later known to history as Qin Shi Huang, a man who understood that unity would not emerge by accident. The fall of Han was not an isolated conquest. It was the opening move toward empire, the first irreversible step in a plan that would reshape an entire civilization. Before there was a unified China, there was a landscape defined by rivalry, ambition, and calculated survival. In the late 3rd century BC, the region was divided among 7 major powers: Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, Qi, and Qin. These were not fragile tribes or temporary coalitions. They were organized states with standing armies, tax systems, fortified cities, and political institutions. Each saw itself as legitimate. Each believed it could outlast the others. For more than 2 centuries, none could deliver a decisive end to the struggle. The Warring States period was a relentless contest of adaptation. Alliances shifted constantly. Diplomats brokered agreements that often dissolved within months. Warfare became increasingly sophisticated with large infantry formations, crossbows, cavalry units, and complex siege operations. Success depended not only on battlefield courage but on logistics, agricultural output, and administrative efficiency. In modern terms, this was competition at scale. Among these states, Qin stood apart. Once dismissed as a frontier power on the western edge of the Chinese world, it had undergone sweeping reforms under the statesman Yang. His legalist policies centralized authority, weakened hereditary aristocrats, and tied military advancement to measurable achievement. Law was strict but consistent. Farmers were incentivized to produce. Soldiers were promoted for performance. The state, not noble families, became the ultimate source of power. Over time, these reforms transformed Qin into something more than just another competitor. It became a disciplined military state with a reliable bureaucracy and the capacity to mobilize resources efficiently. While rival kingdoms struggled with internal divisions and political infighting, Qin steadily strengthened its institutional foundation. By the time Zheng rose to power, Qin was no longer merely expanding. It was positioning itself for something larger. Expansion could increase territory, but empire required dominance. The old balance among the 7 warring states was weakening, and Qin's structural advantages were compounding. What began as territorial growth was evolving into imperial ambition. The world before empire was still divided, but the balance had already begun to tilt. By 230 BC, Qin was strong enough to strike almost anywhere. The real question was not capability, it was choice. Why begin with Han? Why not challenge a larger rival like Chu or Zhao and attempt a dramatic, reputation-defining victory? The answer reveals the disciplined strategic thinking behind Qin's rise. First, geography. Han sat directly east of Qin, positioned like a gate between Qin's western heartland and the central plains. As long as Han remained independent, Qin's path forward was constricted. Supply lines would be vulnerable. Campaigns deeper into enemy territory would require navigating around or through an unstable buffer state. Securing Han was not just expansion, it was clearing the board directly in front of you. In modern strategic terms, it was eliminating friction before scaling operations. Second, psychology. Han was widely regarded as the weakest of the 7 warring states. By targeting the smallest opponent first, Qin reduced immediate risk while sending a powerful signal to the others. This was not reckless aggression. It was controlled escalation. The fall of Han demonstrated that Qin was prepared to eliminate states entirely, not merely weaken them. It forced every neighboring ruler to reconsider their assumptions about balance and survival. Third, logistics and resources. Han's territory offered fertile land, population centers, and critical transportation routes. War at this scale demanded manpower and agricultural surplus. Every campaign required grain, metal, horses, and administrative oversight. Conquering Han strengthened Qin's economic base and created a staging ground for future offensives. It was a move that compounded advantage rather than merely adding territory. For modern entrepreneurs and business leaders, the logic feels familiar. When entering a competitive market, you do not begin by attacking the strongest incumbent head-on. You identify the most strategic entry point, the segment that unlocks access, builds momentum, and strengthens infrastructure. Qin's decision to move against Han reflects that same disciplined thinking. The conquest of Han was not about spectacle. It was about sequencing. By choosing the right first target, Qin transformed expansion into inevitability. The road to empire did not begin with the biggest battle. It began with the smartest one. When Qin finally moved against Han in 230 BC, the campaign did not erupt in chaos. It unfolded with the steady precision of a system built for execution. This was not an emotional charge across the battlefield. It was a coordinated operation years in the making. The mobilization of the Qin army reflected that preparation. Troops were assembled efficiently, drawn from a population long accustomed to structured conscription. Supply chains were organized in advance, ensuring grain, weapons, and equipment moved in rhythm with the advancing forces. Roads and logistical corridors, developed over decades of state planning, allowed Qin to project power with remarkable speed. This was not improvisation. It was infrastructure at work. At the core of Qin's effectiveness was its military organization. Unlike many rival states that still relied heavily on aristocratic command, Qin promoted officers based on merit. Advancement came through measurable achievement in battle. Soldiers were rewarded for discipline and results, not lineage. That system created a culture of accountability. Commanders understood expectations. Units operated within a clear hierarchy. Orders moved downward efficiently, performance data moved upward just as reliably. In modern terms, Qin's army functioned like a results-driven enterprise with aligned incentives. Against such an apparatus, Han struggled. Weakened by years of pressure and lacking the institutional depth of Qin, its defenses could not withstand sustained assault. The collapse was swift not because Han lacked courage, but because it faced an opponent structurally superior in organization and logistics. Cities fell. Resistance fractured. The capital was taken. The Han king surrendered. Yet the most revealing part of the campaign came after the fighting ended. Qin did not leave behind a loose vassal arrangement. It moved immediately toward administrative integration. Han's territory was reorganized into commanderies governed directly by Qin-appointed officials. Local aristocratic power was curtailed. Laws were standardized. The region was absorbed into Qin's bureaucratic framework. This was more than conquest. It was consolidation. The campaign demonstrated that Qin was not merely winning battles. It was expanding a governing system. The fall of Han was decisive, efficient, and methodical, setting a pattern that would define the wars still to come. When Han fell in 230 BC, the military victory was only part of the story. The deeper impact was psychological. Qin had crossed a threshold. For generations, the warring states had fought brutal wars, seized border territories, and imposed humiliating treaties. But the outright elimination of a sovereign state sent a different message. This was no longer competition within a system. Qin was beginning to dismantle the system itself. The remaining powers, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, and Qi, understood the implications immediately. If Han could be absorbed so quickly, none of them were untouchable. The balance of power that had defined the era was no longer stable. Every court had to reassess its strategy. Advisors debated alliances. Generals recalculated troop strengths. Rulers weighed pride against survival. Yet fear does not automatically produce unity. In fact, it often produces hesitation. While the other states recognized the danger, they remained divided by long-standing rivalries and distrust. Zhao distrusted Wei. Chu viewed the northern states with suspicion. Qi calculated its own advantage, hoping distance might buy safety. Efforts to form durable coalitions faltered under the weight of competing interests. Each state feared becoming dependent on another almost as much as it feared Qin. Qin's leadership understood this fragmentation well. Divide and conquer was not merely a battlefield tactic, it was a diplomatic strategy. Envoys exploited tensions, offering temporary assurances to one state while pressuring another. Timing became critical. Qin moved before its rivals could coordinate effectively, isolating targets sequentially rather than confronting a unified front. For a modern audience, the pattern is recognizable. In competitive markets or geopolitical arenas, consolidation often succeeds when competitors fail to align against a rising force. Fragmentation becomes vulnerability. Qin's leadership recognized that psychological momentum can be as decisive as military strength. The fall of Han demonstrated inevitability. And once inevitability takes root in the minds of rivals, resistance weakens. The conquest of Han did more than expand territory. It altered perception. It forced every neighboring ruler to confront a new reality. Qin was not negotiating for advantage. It was advancing toward dominance. And unless the remaining states could overcome their divisions, they would fall one by one. Military victories can win territory, but they do not automatically create empires. That transition requires something more enduring than battlefield success. It requires vision. In the years following the fall of Han, what set Qin apart was not simply its strength, but the clarity of purpose guiding its expansion. At the center of that purpose stood Ing Zheng, the ruler who would later be known as Qin Shi Huang. What distinguished him was not impulsive ambition, but disciplined intent. The conquest of Han was not treated as a final achievement to be celebrated and consolidated indefinitely. It was understood as a step in a longer sequence. Ing Zheng and his advisors were thinking beyond immediate victory. They were asking what kind of political order would replace centuries of fragmentation. Temporary dominance was not enough. The objective was permanence. Centralization became the core of that vision. Rather than allowing conquered territories to retain semi-independent rulers, Qin imposed direct administration. Authority flowed from the center outward. Laws were standardized. Officials were appointed by merit and loyalty to the state, not by inherited privilege. In modern language, Qin was building an integrated operating system for governance. Control was not symbolic, it was structural. This long-term thinking shaped the sequencing of campaigns. Each conquest was chosen not only for tactical feasibility, but for how it positioned Qin for the next move. Territory became staging ground. Resources became fuel for further expansion. The elimination of one rival isolated another. Momentum accumulated deliberately. Ing Zheng understood that sustained pressure prevents adversaries from regrouping. Success breeds leverage, and leverage, applied consistently, compounds. Momentum itself became a form of power. As each state fell, the perception of inevitability grew stronger. Rivals began reacting rather than initiating. Initiative, once seized, rarely returns to its previous holder. For leaders and entrepreneurs, the lesson is clear. Vision determines direction, but structure sustains progress. Qin's rise was not driven by short bursts of aggression. It was propelled by a coherent plan, executed in stages, guided by a leader who saw beyond the next battle to the shape of an entirely new order. The fall of Han in 230 BC was not an isolated event. It was the first tile in a long and deliberate domino line. Once Han collapsed, the tempo of history accelerated. What had been a multipolar balance among rival states shifted into something closer to total war. Each subsequent campaign carried greater urgency, greater scale, and fewer illusions about compromise. Qin was no longer testing its strength. It was executing a program. From Han to total war, the logic was simple: eliminate uncertainty. Every independent state represented a potential coalition partner, a future battlefield, or a lingering threat. So Qin moved methodically, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, and Qi, until resistance itself became fragmented. The domino of conquest was not chaotic. It was sequenced. Each victory reduced the strategic options of the remaining rivals. Out of this cascade emerged what we now call the Qin Dynasty. When Ying declared himself Qin Shi Huang in 221 BC, it was more than a change in title. It marked the birth of a new political architecture. The mechanics of empire replaced the improvisation of wartime alliances. Centralized administration became the backbone of this new order. Feudal lords were removed. Territories were reorganized into commanderies governed by appointed officials who answered directly to the capital. Authority was no longer negotiated, it was structured. For an American audience familiar with federal systems and corporate hierarchies, this was the equivalent of replacing a loose franchise network with a tightly integrated enterprise model. Standardization followed. Qin unified weights and measures, currency, axle widths for carts, and even written script. These policies were not cosmetic. They reduced friction across vast distances. Trade became smoother. Tax collection became predictable. Military logistics became scalable. In modern terms, Qin eliminated incompatible systems so the entire territory could function as one synchronized platform. But empire carries a cost. Massive construction projects, the early Great Wall fortifications, road networks, and the mausoleum guarded by the Terracotta Army required immense labor. Harsh laws and strict enforcement maintained order. The human cost of empire was real, measured in exhaustion, displacement, and lives lost. Stability was purchased at a high price. And yet, the institutional legacy endured. Though the Qin dynasty itself was short-lived, its centralized blueprint shaped Chinese governance for over 2 millennia. The lesson from 230 BC is not merely about conquest. It is about systems. Victory opens the door. Institutions determine whether what lies beyond that door becomes chaos or civilization. For modern leaders, the message is clear: sustainable power is not built on momentum alone, but on the structures that make momentum permanent. The fall of Han, 230 BC, may lack the dramatic flair of a last stand or a legendary battlefield speech, but its quiet finality carries a deeper weight. History often remembers the grand coronations and the sweeping declarations, yet empires are rarely born in spectacle. They begin with decisions, measured, calculated, and deliberate. Han's collapse was not the climax of a story. It was the opening line of one. There is power in beginnings. In business, in leadership, in nation building, the first decisive move often determines the trajectory that follows. When Qin absorbed Han, it signaled that the age of competing kings was giving way to something entirely new. Within a decade, the fragmented world of the warring states would be unified under a single ruler. The man who began as king would become emperor, Qin Shi Huang, and the realm he forged would be remembered as the Qin Dynasty. But none of that would have been possible without the first move. Empire starts with a decision to act when others hesitate, a decision to think long-term while rivals focus on the immediate, a decision to build systems instead of chasing applause. The fall of Han reminds us that transformative change often begins quietly, before headlines, before recognition, before the world fully understands what is unfolding. For those of you building companies, leading teams, or shaping ideas in your own fields, the lesson from 230 BC is timeless. Momentum follows clarity. Great outcomes begin with intentional first steps. If you found value in exploring how a single strategic move reshaped an entire civilization, consider subscribing to the channel. Join us as we continue uncovering the pivotal decisions that changed history and the enduring lessons they hold for leaders today.